Good evening. I'm Bernadine Chuck Fong, and I'm one of the co-directors for the Dale Tillery Institute, our fifth one this time, and we are very, very glad to have you here. What we are planning to do is to start off the Institute with a tribute to Dale Tillery and tell you a little bit about him for those of you who don't know. And then from there, we'll go on to hear some remarks from, I think, two of the people who, for those of you that are in community colleges, two of our higher ed professors who are more in the know about community colleges than a lot of us, and I've been involved in community college work for about 40 years. And so we're very, very pleased, and I'm very, very happy to have both Norton Grubb from UC Berkeley and Yuri Treisman from University of Texas Austin, formerly from UC Berkeley, to be with us tonight. The people that we have in the audience, we have the participants that have registered for the Institute, which begins tonight, but will go on till Wednesday. And how many of you are part of that group that you're going to be here through the next few days? Great, and we're delighted to have you, and of course we've got a lot of work cut out for you starting tomorrow morning, and so we appreciate you coming tonight as well and giving up your Sunday evening. And we welcome all the other guests. We know that we have some from other colleges that are not part of the Institute, and we hope that they will be at another time, and then we also have guests from the university. So we're very, very pleased to have all of you here. We also have one of our esteemed notables, Pat Cross. Pat, would you stand up, who has been a friend of who I'm sure you know has been a friend to community colleges for many years, and she's also been a supporter of the Institute. And I have to blame Pat for getting me involved in this particular institute and introducing me to Norton, and we've had, I think, a very good time in planning these sessions each year for you. So, oh dear. Are you okay? Okay, okay.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. Do you need some ice or something?
No, I just
okay. Oh dear. Okay. Anyway, with that, I'd like to first introduce Norton Grubb. He really needs no introduction, and he has been the David Gardner Professor of Higher Education here at UC Berkeley for a number of years. He also has been a noted author of many, many works. He's been very involved in career technical education, vocational education in the workforce, and of course, I think it's your 10th anniversary of your book, Yes, so you didn't know it was your 10th anniversary of his Honored but Invisible book. If you have not read it, that I really encourage you to do so. And just as an aside, Norton will introduce Yuri, but Yuri and I are involved with the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching in some community college work. And Norton, what you don't know is that there are a number of university professors from Michigan, UCLA, Stanford, and where else, that are at a retreat starting tonight, and they are huddled with your book because they want to learn more about community colleges, community college faculty, and what they can do to be part of this entire movement. So we're very pleased to have your book honored as well. So with that, I do want to introduce Norton, who will say a few words about Dale Tillery, and then we'll introduce Yuri. So this isn't the microphone, but you just need to speak.
What would be the point of that?
Because it's a university and form matters.
So I'm going to add my welcome to that of Bernadine, and tomorrow you're going to get a third welcome from David Pearson, the Dean of the School of Education. So by the time that comes around, you will be well welcomed, I hope. This is, in fact, in honor of Dale Tillery. Dale Tillery was a faculty member at UT Berkeley in the heyday of the higher education program here. The heyday was, I think, the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, when there was a large corpus of faculty members and the Carnegie Council on Higher Education. Pat is here to correct me if I get any of these historical details wrong. So there was a great deal of activity, and Dale was the person who particularly focused on community colleges and was head of the Community College Leadership Program. He started as a community college instructor, and then he was a dean for instruction at Contra Costa College, and then he came onto the faculty at UC Berkeley. He had a multi-part career. He, of course, wrote and published. What do professors do? They write and publish. If they don't, they perish. So he began his writing with a very well-known book called Breaking the Access Barrier back in 1971. And so, of course, that signals his interest in the issues of access and equity in community colleges. which is something he continued and that we have tried to memorialize in the Tillery Institutes. He wrote a book called The Transition from School to College in the mid-70s. Well, that's 30 years. I mean, this is now a hot topic again, right? So he was either before his time or too far ahead of his time, but he was worrying about this problem well before anybody else was. We might do well to go back and see what he had to say in that book. He wrote a very, very well-known book called Renewing the American Community College in the mid-'80s, at which point the kind of expansion of the community colleges was about 20 years old, and it was time for kind of stock taking, and that was the point of that very widely known book. I want to mention a fourth piece of work that he did because of its personal importance to me and the importance to one of the topics that will come up tomorrow. And that is, he wrote a little book, a little monograph on career ed and elitism, in which he did argue that the opposition between OC-Ed, or career technical education, and general education, or academic education, was destructive. This was destructive to both of them. And he made an argument that the two ought to be merged or integrated or somehow combined, rather than constantly seeing life as one of OC-Ed versus general education or academic education. We'll see this coming up tomorrow. One of the forms that basic skills instruction has taken is its integration with some occupational courses. I spent a great deal of time in the 90s, I have to say, worrying about the forms of integrating CTE and academic education in community colleges. That has had some clear benefits in high schools, in structures called pathways, and I believe it still is of great interest in community colleges. And I will present some results tomorrow morning on the greater effectiveness of following this path that Dale Tillery laid out, of trying to integrate rather than keep separate, as we say in English, academic and vocational education. He played many other roles as well, which is not always true of Berkeley faculty. It's clear from the graduates of the higher ed program. Are there any graduates of the higher ed program who are here? Yes. That he was a very well-known and very well-loved mentor to his graduate students. There's an entire generation of Dale Tillery students who are out in colleges and working in higher education in other ways. He worked on various aspects of the California Master Plan for Higher Education, which all of you know as the 1960 Master Plan Compact that stood as the basis for California higher education. It seems to have frayed in the last 10 years or so. It's 40 years old, almost 50 years old, so it's not surprising that the conditions that led to the 1960 Master Plan have changed somewhat, but it certainly has been widely seen as the foundation of higher education in California, and the foundation of a system that has both elite institutions and more democratic institutions like the California community colleges. He did a great deal of consulting with colleges, and when I met him, when I first came to Berkeley about 20 years ago, he was continuing to help colleges, particularly in hiring presidents and other upper-level administrators. His special concern was the issue of equity. His attachment to the community college was as a democratic institution that accepts all students from all kinds of backgrounds and provides access to higher education for students who wouldn't otherwise find it. And so to memorialize that, we have focused each of the Tillery Institutes on some aspect of equity. The first one was about equity and leadership issues. The second one was about English as a second language, ESL. The third was about basic skills and student support and the role that student support can play in conjunction with basic skills. The fourth, last year, was about improving the transition from high school to college. Again, one of these issues that Dale Tillery worried about and that seems to be the hot topic of the moment. Of course, this year's institute is focused on data and planning, again, to enhance basic skill instruction. Basic skill instruction seems to be the issue whose time has come. Yuri, is it okay to say that? The Carnegie Foundation seems to be deciding to pursue this as one of its main initiatives in the coming years. So this is sort of on the agenda. And if any of you have been reading the 250-page piece of legislation that Barack Obama signed at Macomb Community College, who's been going over this legislation? I'm curious to see who's been trying. Well, it's 250 pages. It's a monster. But there's a tremendous amount in there about basic skills and developmental education, about integrating it with conventional coursework, and about various ways of improving the community college. I think in many ways it's a very deft, piece of legislation, and one that will promote the equity agenda as well. I want to note the sponsors of the Tillery Institute. Dale Tillery's longtime companion partner is Jerry Carazzo, and Jerry has graciously given an endowment which provides funding for the Tillery Institute, again in his memory. That's supplemented with funds from the David Gardner Chair, which I hold, which Pat Cross held before me. This is a chair which someone, I don't know who it is actually, gave in memory, not in memory, he's not dead yet, gave in honor of David Gardner for many, many years of hard work as the University of California president, including hard work in the last recession, the last serious recession we had of 1990-92, when he came under attack in ways that Mark Yudof is now coming under attack. And in honor of him, this chair was given. You will see people from the Basic Skills Leadership Institute here who have graciously contributed. The Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching has asked Yuri to come out, and we benefit from that. And then you'll see various presenters, particularly from CalPAS, over the next 3 days. So it's in memory of Dale Tillery that we have engaged in this, and we hope you will honor his memory by going forth and being increasingly concerned about the equity provisions in the colleges you come from. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Yuri Treisman. Yuri is a mathematician by training. He got his PhD here at Berkeley, and was also did a lot of work in math education. I think the thing that made Yuri famous first was discovering, so to speak, that the African American students and Asian students were doing very differently in their calculus courses. And he discovered that the African American students were studying by themselves, and the Asian American students were studying in groups and clumps and reinforcing one another. And that sort of was a breakthrough in trying to figure out how to improve the performance of students going through calculus. I believe, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, that this then led to the Emerging Scholars Program at UT Austin, which is an attempt to increase the success of underrepresented students in calculus, which is, of course, a gateway course. And he may talk about that a little bit. I'll leave that up to him. But the point about the Emerging Scholars Program is that it has 4 or 5 kind of reinforcing elements to it. It's a nice model for a program that isn't a single element program, but has multiple elements, each of which has a clear reason for being in trying to improve the math performance of students who traditionally have not done well in these courses. Yuri has gone on to do many, many things at the national level. Many of them you can read in his little bio. But of course, the one that I must mention is the one that always gets the most mixed feelings from other academics, and that is that he won the MacArthur Award in 1992, commonly known as the Genius Award. All the rest of us are waiting for the phone call from the MacArthur Foundation, and we are all so disappointed that we haven't gotten it. So it is with a mixture of admiration, touched with a tinge of envy, that I present Yuri Treisman.
I will forget it. So you'll excuse some nostalgia. All the different things that generate nostalgia are intersecting here. First, California community colleges. Not on my CV, but I put it on every year. The department removes it, is the fact that I started at Pierce Community College. Horticulture. My AA degree in horticulture. I went to LACC. I worked as a certificated groundsman. And years ago, I gave the opening talk at LACC to the certificated workers on the faculty Welcome Back Day. And my old gardening buddies retired my gardening uniform, which I have in a frame. So, and I remember, took me 5 years to get through, right? Working really hard, had a wonderful accident, and I want to honor this. I loved math, but I was working 40 to 60 hours a week, like most of your students, or many of your students. And I loved math, so I would take my lunch break at LACC. I was planting Formium tenax, I still remember, and Strelitzia nicolai over the campus. And I would take my lunch break outside one of the temporary buildings, which I am sure is still a temporary building. And I would listen and eat my lunch to the calculus lecture. And Jack Stutzman, math professor at LACC, saw me, came outside, invited me to have my lunch, and I found out later that he told his students that they could bring lunch to class because he knew that unless I could eat then, I would have no time to eat. Right? So there is a mensch, a guy who did fantastic, beautiful stuff. He had a cousin, I think, or a brother-in-law, who worked at what was then Valley State. Now I'm sure it's the Interplanetary University of Northridge with name inflation, right? And he got me a job there, so I was able to transfer and work as a grader, right, also as a gardener. And then someone there got me a job at UCLA, and I was able to transfer to UCLA. And I still remember working in landscape, working my way up, but deciding I had enough. I really wanted to get an education, and I called friends at Berkeley. I'd been writing little papers on my own, trying to figure out what it was like to do that. And I was invited up by Abe Seidenberg to come and talk about math. And I stayed at the Women's Faculty Club here. And I remember that I grew up really poor, right? And I was a working man, right? I was not accustomed to the Women's Faculty Club with all these very elegant elderly women. And there was a buffet that was great buffet served at the faculty club. And this food was good. And I used all my architectural knowledge, right? And remember piling a plate this high full of stuff, walking back to my seat, and one of the elderly women came up to me and she said, "Young man, you may return as often as you like to the buffet." I remember wanting to crawl under the rug. And then I came here to do math, and I knew right away that I really was an outsider because when I came here, I was 10 years older than the other graduate students, I think. Right? And I was just fascinated by how these students here felt like they owned the world. Right? I always felt like a visitor, right, to campus, and they felt like they owned the world. I just needed to understand who they were. And I wanted to work as a teacher because I owed teachers. And I went over to the School of Ed, procrastinating on my dissertation. And Jim Stone and Ned Flanders were offering courses at a time when I could take them. And they were wonderful. And they took me under their wing, and they allowed me to do what I really care about, right, which is working on public education, working on higher education. And then I was lucky to have Leon Henkin, the chair of the math department, who understood that I really wanted to work on education. And after getting me to work on all kinds of cohomology spaces, he finally said, "This is not in your heart, is it?" I said, it's not in my heart. He says, what is in your heart? I said, equity. How do we make colleges vehicles for upward mobility? And he said, well, I don't know much about that, but I'm going to roll up my sleeves and we're going to figure it out together. Right? And he helped me. So you probably remember when you woke up the first time and looked in the mirror and saw your parent, saw your mother or your father. And it's vaguely disorienting because we all have this illusion that we create ourselves. I remember the time I woke up, looked in the mirror, and saw my thesis advisor, who I so sorely miss, right? And always wonder how it is that, you know, we could do as well as some of our best teachers. It's also a reminder of the power of what teachers can do. Because even on a really shitty day, right, you can just pick a student and you can do something enormously wonderful for that student, right? And there are very few privileged positions of that type. And it's easy to forget that in the midst of budget crises and all of this stuff, right? All the policy, the master plan, Clark Kerr. I remember being on campus when Reagan came in and he was fired. Do you remember what he said when he was fired? I leave this job as I entered it, fired with enthusiasm. So Bernadette asked me to talk about mixing the practice wisdom about student success with some of the new work in motivational psychology, some of the new use of large data sets to actually improve instruction. So this is a hybrid talk, and it's about work that I'm doing not at the community college level yet, although I'm mobilizing to start this work with networks of community colleges, but working at the interface of middle school and high school. I have, however, now been at 20 community colleges, visiting them, interviewing students in developmental math. And the protocol is always the same. When you visit a community college, the first thing you do is you take a day and you teach there the developmental courses. Because when you teach the courses, you actually learn about the institution in a way that you cannot learn about it from people telling you about it. Right? And then I've been interviewing students about their purposes, their hopes, their fears, right? Why they want to go there. I just came from Bronx Community College a few days ago and spent 2 days teaching and interviewing students. And what a complex population of students, enormously diverse. And when we look at the developmental sequences, these things are burial grounds for the aspirations of myriad students. Right? When you look at the data sets, there are some really good data sets, by the way, from Florida. Almost as good data sets in Texas, not quite as good as Florida. Ohio, North Carolina have fairly good data sets. So you can actually track what happens to students who take developmental, who had similar background, who didn't. And what we see is that roughly 1 in 6 students who takes developmental courses actually passes a credit-bearing transferable course. And what's actually quite remarkable when you look at the data is that, and this is this beautiful data by Calcagno looking at Florida community colleges, and what you see is that all these courses are anchored in college algebra and pre-calculus, and that even students who are extremely well prepared on placement tests, only half of them pass that course. Right? Looking at 100,000 student transcripts that Bob Zemsky put together, 14% of the students who got A's in that course went on to get B or better in second semester calculus. So we basically are in a system in which you don't need sophisticated statistics to talk about success. You can have photographs of the students. Right? And in fact, one of the things you notice as sort of an amateur ethnographer is that when you go to community college departments and you ask about their successful students, they tell you their names. Right? They know them. they're exceptions, right? So that's a mark that we have a system that isn't actually working for a very large number of students. That's not to say that the people who are working with these students aren't deeply depressed about it, right? And a lot of the faculty interviews that I'm doing, and I'm a very positive asset-based guy. That's the whole foundation of my work. But I have to say that in interviewing community college faculty who teach these courses, when you ask them if they like their work, they're very positive about their own classes. But when you ask them, are they really contributing to the larger purposes that drew them into the world, to raising upward mobility, many of them don't feel that they're really contributing to the bigger goals of community college. They feel good about particulars in their class. And when you have a system in which lots of people don't feel good about the bigger goals, which are often articulated in leadership, it can have a corrosive effect on their spirit, right? And I see some of that in these systems. And unless we can sort of directly challenge this and refocus more on the assets and successes, we're going to have a hard time mobilizing people to take the next set of challenges that have to be taken in these systems. It's hard to say, but it's just the empirical finding from going around and speaking with lots of people. There are very few people who feel bad about their own classes, but who feel good about the program as a whole. So I'm going to say a little about some of my earlier work to draw parallels. I'm going to talk about things that I see that impress me, and then some ideas from the research literature that people are starting to play with in other places that might be useful to you along the line of research and data. So when I was procrastinating on my dissertation here, as Norton said, I was working on a really nasty problem. And I'd work on it for 3 hours, and then I would run away, right, and come back. And I ran to Jim Stone and Ned Flanders and had this idea that I really wanted to understand why students succeed at Berkeley and why other students didn't. And we constructed a giant survey. I had gotten a $600,000 grant from the Ford Foundation because there was a dean here. The old joke, he was so inept the other deans noticed. And he had told someone at Ford, Ben Payton, who's now the president of Tuskegee, that the math department at Berkeley, quote, wanted to re-engineer itself as a vehicle of social change. He was prone to exaggeration. And Ben Payton, who's become a good friend, and I just saw, thought that was so funny. He was just leaving Ford. He had some extra money. He was about to take off for Tuskegee. And he gave me a $600,000 grant to study the reasons that students succeed at Berkeley, but African-American students don't. And you know, the only thing he wanted was a set of hypotheses about student failure. Very smart science kind of guy. And he told me many years after, he just wanted the Berkeley faculty to put down on a piece of paper what they really believed. He thought that was worth 600,000 bucks. So Leon Henkin, you know, some of you know this story, made a questionnaire, mimeograph questionnaire, sent it out, 400 faculty responded. And people really cared about this. This was the height of the civil rights movement. It was the 60s, you know, early 70s. People were proud of bringing new generations of students to campus, and were really quite unhappy about their failure to help them succeed. And they were puzzled by this. And Leon quoted the data. There was no year in a decade in which 2 African-American students got B or better in calculus here. It was really very bad, high failure rates. And he asked, why do you think this is true? And we had 400 responses, and the reasons were, 1, motivation. The faculty, remind you, the faculty couldn't name a particular student, unlike community college faculty who can, right? But people didn't actually know who the students were, but they had very strong ideas about why they were failing. Right? This was not what you'd call a data-driven enterprise. Right? Motivation was the first. Steve Diliberto, I think now gone, famous mathematician, made a differential equations model explaining how differences in motivation would produce the actual grade distributions that we reported. Right? That it was the fault of their high schools they went to, and the faculty wasn't aware that many of the students of color who came here came from elite high schools, grew up in the suburbs in largely white environments. Right? But there was this stereotyping that was just devastating. And then there were mythologies about family and income and things of that sort. And there was one guy named Jensen, who was in the School of Education here, who wrote an amazing letter. So he was a population biologist, I think, and he believed that certain folks, African Americans, were genetically dumber. Right? He wrote this letter that said, I am dismayed by what I've seen in the data you report. My best estimate, he had gone and gotten student records, he said, my best estimates of student characteristics was that they could account for at most 1/10 of a difference in GPA. He said, the students come here are quite exceptional. Therefore, it must have something to do with our institutional practices. Right? So the only person who actually looked at the data said, whoa, wait a minute, these students are actually pretty strong who are coming here. Right? It must have something to do with us. Everybody else assumed it was the students, right? And some trait that they had which prevented their success. So, you know, we went about trying to study this, and I want to not tell the whole story, but just some of the big lessons that are analogous to what I'm seeing in the developmental ed world. Well, John Ogbu, who is a famous anthropologist, now also gone, I feel really old. My students, when they email me, expect me to respond in 2 seconds. I tell them that when I email my colleagues and they don't respond, I just assume they're dead. The pleasures of aging, right? So John Ogbu had taken us under his wing, and a wonderful man. And we went out, we interviewed students, 20 African American, 20 Chinese, Cantonese-speaking Chinese students, which meant they had to learn Cantonese. Great for procrastinating on your dissertation. Right? We went out, and we saw some things that actually were pretty stunning. Of course, the faculty explanations really were irrelevant, were meaningless. The students we had were very highly motivated. I mean, first week of school, we interviewed people. They were terrified. They were really charged up, right? And we were confusing, I think, motivation with disorientation, right? We saw that the students from well-to-do families were doing less well than the students from low-income families at that time, for all kinds of reasons that became clear when we actually spoke to the people. Right, followed them around on dates, moved into the dorms. This was before IRB. Right, you can do all kinds of stuff then you can't do now. But what we saw was, first of all, that the people who were helping the students as part of the professionalization of advising were very separate from the faculty. They were in the basement mostly of the administration building. They were in things called learning centers. And it made you think that if they were the learning center, what was the faculty? So what you had are individual faculty who don't talk with each other. And Norton actually wrote about this in your book. You know, same observations. That here are the students in classes with people who don't speak to each other, who have to sort of figure out what the faculty are about. And the faculty aren't trying to figure out what the students are about. And then you have a whole industry, right? So it started in the 60s, professionalizing of advising, doing study skills and generic stuff that very few students were able to transfer, run by people whose whole professional life and sense of being was organized around student success, and they had control of certain things but not actual instruction. So that, and almost all of the stuff in the student success movement of the time was deficit-based. Retention sounded like a kidney ailment. Everything was organized around someone's notion of what the students didn't have. I think we've all learned the lesson that when you look at community college programs, some of the Achieving the Dream things, the Valencia, the Northern Virginia, the first thing you figure out is that the faculty and the administration put together a team, and decided to actually build a program based on the strengths of the students as they found them. Right? That has to be a universal impression of speaking to people doing wonderful work and actually get forward traction. But much of this stuff, because it's administratively organized, was focused on problems that students had, not on usable strengths. The second thing we found that really blew us away was that students who were getting A's in certain preparatory courses were doing very poorly in the courses that those things were supposedly preparatory for. Vince Tinto just found this in community college developmental ed, who was talking about this. Another very perceptive writer on higher ed. So when higher ed says that course A is a prerequisite for course B, no one has an evidence standard for making that claim. We're just allowed to say it because we think it. We get a group of people together in a room and they decide what should be true, and no one ever looks at the numbers. So one of my PhD students, who was the vice president of institutional research at UT Austin, found 14% of the students who got A's in pre-calculus got B's or better in second semester calculus, right, in a national sample. So large numbers of courses don't actually work. And thinking back to the 60s and 70s, there was an old feminist slogan that caring really matters, but rock-solid clarity about the real requirements for success matter a lot more. Right? And I think that's something which is really important for us to keep in mind. Because what you see is traditional efforts to tutor students, build learning communities for students in courses that do not work, even if students get A's in them. So and this, I think we can say that this borders not just on the professionally irresponsible, but really crosses the ethical line. Because when institutions give students high grades in courses, that really has to mean something. And right now, looking around, no one's checking that it does. There are exceptional places, Valencia, some of the Washington State community colleges, and looking at the Washington State folks who have a lot of interesting things going on up there on basic adult ed, basic skills initiatives. They were horrified when they looked at their own data. They could not believe that courses they were trying to help students pass would not pay off for those students, even if they succeeded in them. And then when you look at, I actually not doing PowerPoint tonight because I'm trying to cure myself. I'm like Alcoholics Anonymous kind of thing. And if you want to get off it quick, Google, what if Abraham Lincoln used PowerPoint at Gettysburg? If you haven't seen that PowerPoint presentation, it will reduce your use of PowerPoint. But being a guy who studies nonlinear dynamics in my day job, we actually looked at about 20 colleges at treating students as a fluid moving through these systems. This is about to be published by the National Research Council. And you could just see how many places where students are doing well in developmental mathematics, where they do well and then they don't show up next semester or they do poorly next semester. Every time there's a break, as you folks, I think, know, it's opportunity for students to get derailed and get lost. So in some places, in many California community colleges, we have 4 developmental courses in a row before you get to college algebra, which I'm going to say something about in a minute that's not flattering to that course. Right? You just look at the students, and about half of them die at each level, almost at every performance level in that course. But yet we keep ordering the system because we organized it around a faculty set of perceptions about student deficits and things we wish them to know, not based on evidence of what they would actually need to move forward. This turned out to be the pre-calculus problem, because when students get stuck in calculus, just bear with me for a minute, non-math people, it's because they can't solve optimization problems and related rate problems. They can't solve them because they can't set them up with the basic geometry. There's no geometry in any of the pre-calculus courses. So those courses weren't designed from backward mapping for what you really need to know, right? They were actually designed around a wish list of what someone hoped that students would have, but more often, faculty's memories of what they themselves had when they came into these courses. And the stakes are just too high for too many of our students. Because when I spoke to these students, as diverse as they are, I felt common DNA with them. They're working like I worked. They did not understand what going to college was like, was supposed to be like. There were virtually no perspective-giving tools for them to make sense and normalize their expectation of what was being asked of them. So what did we find? We found students disoriented. They believed, when I interviewed students here, as I'm interviewing students at Bronx Community College, right, and Texas, at Austin Community College, at Seattle Central Community College, when you ask students how you're supposed to succeed in college, they tell you you're supposed to show up on time, do your homework, and they have a set of recipes that they've learned which have basically no evidentiary evidence behind them. The institutions themselves haven't empirically figured out, right, what you have to do to succeed in these courses. Again, there are exceptions, but when you look at the field as a whole, it's sort of non-scaling islands of excellence. And the field suffers from collective amnesia. Everyone, it feels like they can't learn from other people's work. When you look even at Achieving the Dream, which is, I think, better than average campuses really trying hard, there's very little crossover from site to site. It's mostly reporting about work at particular places. It's hard to find examples of people building off other folks' work. And this is really not a good way to build a better field, right? This kind of, everyone does it their own, and it's fractal-like. On the campus, every faculty member does it alone, right? So the campuses are sort of like evolved into gigantic immunological systems, loosely coupled, so that it's virtually impossible to affect core instruction, which means that the solutions tend to live over in the administration building, trying to compensate for the fact, right, that there's academic freedom, that faculty, there are deep traditions of faculty doing their own thing. And that does not work for our students. Right. So just to finish the Berkeley story and then talk about some of the stuff I find exciting now. Right. What we figured out with a lot of help, and I do owe Jim Stone and Ned Flanders because they actually knew how to look at things, right? They were not amateurs, and I was. Right? That the first problem was to integrate the student supports and the academic supports for students in one coherent environment. Because students who are struggling and who feel that they're losing ground are the least able to integrate sources of support coming from different directions. Right? They're the ones who need an integrated support system. This was very, very challenging to put together. So we thought, okay, we need to give a uniform message. We need to build perspective-gaining tools, which is a word that I don't know where we came from. It came from someone at Stanford. There was when we went to try to figure out how to do this stuff, we went to the library and took out books called How to Teach and stuff like that. I mean, we were really doing this from the beginning. It was like the David Lodge joke, how to wire a lamp, how to weave a rug, how to teach. And I remember in one of these books, they talked about students need perspective. So we actually collected data on all kinds of tasks, put them on punch cards, had thousands of problems, and we actually built contingency matrices of which problems should students work on if they were going to have the highest probability that they would actually succeed on later problems. Right? This is the part of the work that very few people were interested in. But it turned out that if students were behind, we learned that the evidence standard for what they worked on had to be much higher. Right? Now we have 500,000 students, high school students online, so we can do this extremely efficiently. And it turns out to be one of the most humbling things in the world for faculty to take 5 or 6 problems on the same topic and try to guess which one better prepares students for a later problem. And this is something we have to do in our developmental programs, especially in mathematics and regular science programs where it's relatively easy to do. Because students are coming to us undereducated for many reasons, very few of them their own fault. If they're going to catch up, they need intensity, acceleration, and they need efficiency. What they work on, we have to have an evidence at every grain size, every problem, every sequence of problems. We need to know the contingencies and expectations that if they can do them, they can do other tasks. What happened when we started building these canonical tasks, and this was just an accident of someone who had been at Princeton who switched from linguistics to mathematics. We actually started interviewing the students. Once we had a standard set of so-called worksheet problems, we started interviewing students about them. And it turns out that a lot of students could do the easy parts of the problems, but very few students could do the hard parts. And it turned out that the language you need for the hard parts was completely different than the language you needed from the easy parts. Because the hard parts of the problem always were the language of generality. They required constructions like let x equal, suppose that, right? They had the whole language of generalization, of invertibility, and so on. And no one was teaching the language of the hard parts of problems to the students. And it also turned out, this was fascinating, that there were about 500 words in the calculus books and in the pre-calculus books, like indicate, structure, compare, contrast, that virtually none of the students knew the meaning of. They thought they knew the meaning of the terms, but they didn't actually. So we sort of discovered, when we looked at the general beginnings of English language learner stuff, that really it was good ideas, but it didn't have an evidence base, an empirical base to it. And now this work I'm working on now with Catherine Snow at Harvard. There are actually some of her doctoral students who were here in the School of Education who are doing similar work in this area, probably disconnected from the math ed folks. I got to connect you up to them. But it's the same series of stuff we did back at Berkeley with Leon Henkin, who was fascinated by language. And there were a whole series of dissertations that came out of this, identifying the linguistic structures that you actually need for working on challenging problems. It turned out that we had to build for students who had been in bad classes beforehand, where they just scribbled answers, right? Didn't write anything down. We had to build editing drills, and we learned to pick problems that students would get right. And once they got them right, and only when they got them right, would we stop, put them up on the board, and say, let's now learn how to code switch and describe, solve these problems the way they're solved in math books, and learn the language. And it took about 2 months for students before they'd routinely say if-then constructions, let x equal, and all these things that not only are necessary for challenging problems, but actually mark membership in the academic community. So the bottom line of it was, what we found is a set of caring activities that were disconnected from evidence. And most of them had an implicit deficit model to them. Right? And then we had faculty doing their own thing. And if students were lucky enough to get someone who cared about them, they would be successful. But students really found it hard to figure. This was your observation also. It was very hard. The responsibility was put on the student to figure out what the faculty expected, not the faculty's responsibility to figure out what the student's prior knowledge was and actually to build on it in some meaningful way. So I want to switch now to current work, revisiting all these things in community colleges and in high school. One of the big differences so we've interviewed more than 800 community college students now. And there really is, for the students in developmental courses, a very low sense of self-efficacy among many of them. I think it's different from motivation, But when you ask students whether they think they're going to do well in the course, so here's the first question on the protocol. Tell me about the last positive experience you had in mathematics. That's question one. So it's a semi-structured interview, right? First question, tell me about your last positive experience in mathematics. What do you think you get for developmental math students? Not kidding. Second grade, kindergarten, third grade, nothing in high school, virtually nothing in middle school. So the large portion of the population has no memory of ever being competent in the field and no narrative, internal narrative of success. This was different than the Berkeley students who thought that they were, for good reason, extraordinarily prepared. And then they came into a system that just ate them for breakfast, right? Here I have Mark McFerrin, all the children of the Black Ministerial Alliance in Oakland, religious. He'd come in with his prayer book, and I remember him seeing these jocks in front of him having a copy of Playboy, and he comes to me, he says, they will fail. They will suffer, right? They will burn in eternal damnation. And he had the illusion that they didn't study, right? Of course, they really studied their butts off, right? And they worked together, and they had old exams and all of this stuff. Here are these poor students coming in complete isolation, disconnected from the institution, right? It was like a gas station for them. They drove up. They thought they were good in class. They drive away, and they thought that actually contributed, you could succeed that way. We found almost no students who succeeded that way, right? With community college students in developmental courses, however, they're not coming in with a set of mastery scripts. So if you look at it from a research perspective, the modern theory of energization and motivation, the basic routine of it is success is driven by effort, right? Effort is driven by belief that you can succeed, perceived self-efficacy, and perceived self-efficacy is fed by four sources, four rivers. The first river, this is one of the most replicated pieces of modern motivation theory and energization theory. The first river is mastery stories. People who succeed and are motivated, energized, remember times when they succeeded, and they remember times when they got stuck and worked through it. Right? This is extremely important. If you have no memories and internal narratives of having overcome challenges in a particular course, then William James's ideas apply. If you don't believe you could succeed at something, you're not going to put a lot of effort into trying. That's a 100-year-old psychology. That was William James said that in the 1890s, right? He nailed it. Bandura said it in the 1970s, came back to it. So the first source is mastery stories. The second is vicarious experiences. That people who succeed know cases or stories of other people who are sort of like them who succeed. They have images of success, right? Vicariously they can succeed. Social persuasions, which is what I found, is the third. People who hang out with people who succeed are much more likely to succeed. And people who hang out with people who believe they're going to succeed tend to put forth a lot more energy. And then the fourth, for which there's a new meta-analysis of 4,000 studies by Rich Lerner at Tufts, we're on data crunching, right? Shows that people who succeed have useful attributions of their internal stresses. They take somatic information, like stress levels, and they say, struggle is good, I'm going to learn. Right? People who have the opposite attributions, who say, this is hard, I probably can't do it, give up quickly. So the modern engineering of student support programs is sort of built on this new theory, that sort of the new versions of Bandura's theory, that if these are the sources of support, how do you build directly into developmental courses experiences that feed each of these rivers? How do you build mastery stories? So what we're doing is creating a set of problems, with field testing them. We just did this now with 200 urban high schools New York, LA, Dallas, Chicago, right? In which we built these little units called Getting Unstuck and Working Through Confusion, built around the Shell Center, beautiful Mars tasks and things like this for the math people here. Assessments where you know students can all get started, but they'll all get stuck. Right? It takes about 6 of these before students actually start reminding themselves of these stories, if you engineer experiences in which they're going to succeed most of the time. Attributions. Beautiful studies now. Catherine Good at Barnard shows that if this is the Carol Dweck, I don't know if you've seen Mindset. This is a scourge on the face of education, by the way. Researcher does damage. Says that if your views or intelligence are not fixed but malleable, if you know that effort really works, you'll be motivated and succeed. What we're finding all over the place is that kids say, okay, they try hard and they fail. And as soon as they fail, they go, oh my God, I must really be dumb. Because for everyone else, effort pays off and it doesn't pay off for me. What Catherine Good and others showed is that students who know that effort usually works but doesn't always work, right, are much more likely to succeed. So there's this whole set of research now on what is the fine microarchitecture of attributions that successful students have that allow them not to be derailed by failure, but to understand that failure is necessary. This architecture of social persuasion. So many people are experimenting with learning communities, but when you actually go and look, there's not a lot of there. Right? And when you interview people about them, they tell you different things about why they're doing it. Social support. Sophisticated teachers will tell you learning communities are great because I can actually then perceive where the students are. Right? Some people give Vygotskian explanations of it. What the child can do today, he can do by himself. He can do in a group today, he can do by himself tomorrow. So actually organizing learning communities around problems that generate good work for student discussion is much more profitable. These are excellent tasks for our developmental reading and mathematics programs. To build a corpus of problems that we can use as metrics to help see our students learn and to help students measure their own learning. So what we've done is with 500,000 students, we've actually, as I said, built the expectancy tables. And we're now trying to improve the actual tasks that people work on with higher levels of evidence. And we need to mobilize a community of faculty who are going to actually do this and reintegrate the student support functions with the academic functions on our campus. Because otherwise, students will not be as likely to make the transfer from what they're learning in study skills, right, to their academic courses. The other rivers have to do with goal setting, right? One of the things we're learning from students who succeed in these courses is they naturally choose achievable goals. But what Rich Lerner found out that really blew me away, I went right back in and just shifted my teaching around this. He found that not only did students choose achievable goals, but more important, they really monitored their progress on them, and they expected to have to change their strategy. Students who did not expect to have to change their strategy tended to get derailed, demoralized, and stopped. So one of the things we need to do as a community is we need to build a science base for what we're doing. We need to build some standard reference courses and relentlessly improve them and start measuring what we can reasonably expect in helping students catch up and get on track for things they cared about. So now here's some big problems as this talk gets scattered and random. College algebra. The overwhelming majority of students in California community colleges are taking developmental courses aimed at college algebra or pre-calculus. The idea that pre-calculus should be a terminal course is a certain amount of irony to it that pre-anything should be a terminal course. 6% of community college students enrollments, according to the Conference Board of Mathematical Sciences, only 6% take calculus courses. Already 9% take statistics. You know what? Most majors, other than technical majors, require statistics and not college algebra. College algebra is useless, says this professor of mathematician, for all but a small number of students going into fields that require calculus. And if you need calculus in your work, you need a lot of math, not freshman calculus. There are virtually no careers or jobs in which freshman calculus suffices. So we've built a gigantic system to prepare people for a meaningless course. This is what I would call Old Testament bad. Rivers of blood, frogs, locust, right? It might as well be Latin, right? It effectively operates, I can see it, the declension of quadratic equations. We can actually mix these two things, right? When you look at the pathways that students are on, almost all of them are on a pathway through college algebra or pre-calculus, and we need to build pathways through statistics because the evidence appears to suggest that we can get students from nothing through a real statistics course that meets the American Statistical Association GAZE guidelines in 1 year from scratch. And that would be 70 to 75% of the majors that they're actually entering into. We have all these people who want to be EMTs, nurses, firemen, and they're getting hung up in factoring cubics. I want them to have a deep sense of number sense, right, and to know something about confidence intervals, right, to understand statistical data. Virtually none of your developmental students are being organized. Now, there are students who need to take calculus. We want to build a really good pathway through it with better evidence, but we can't let the weight of history affect the lives of myriad students. So this is the question about evidence standards, evidence base. What's the evidence base for each task we ask students to work on? What's the evidence base for the requirements that we have? Is the weight of history enough? That gets tied in with you need algebra 2, basically, intermediate algebra in community colleges to take statistics in a lot of places. Why? Because a group of math people sit down and decide. This is too important for math people to be allowed to decide. This is about hundreds of thousands of people's lives. Right? We have to have better reasons than the math faculty decided algebra 2 should be a prerequisite. Right? So what's my message here? We have inherited a system that originally was designed with good purposes. Right? One of the things about systems, I remember taking David Stern's economics course. Is he still around? He made it. He's retired. Oh shit, do I feel old. So I like to joke that I took him when I was very young. He made us read Max Weber, Economy and Society, 1920-21. And in Max Weber, reading Max Weber is painful, right? The verbs are at the end of the paragraphs. The sentences are 8 sentences long. And you go on this beautiful thing on the power of bureaucracy and how wonderful it is, right? Because he loved bureaucracy and its efficiency as opposed to the family enterprise. And then, like on page 120, he goes into this jazz riff about the iron cage. He says, why is it that systems we build with passion and purpose and caring end up being driven by rules and structures and imprison us in an iron cage of our own making? Right? And then he goes back to these gigantic paragraphs that you need to read with an alarm clock. We have a system that we created for good purposes that isn't working for our students. We are mathematicians, we're scientists, we're scholars, we're teachers. We have to ask harder questions about the evidence for these courses at every single level. We cannot allow our students to take courses that don't work, even when they get A's in them. Right? We need to know the proportion of students who are succeeding in these courses at each level of achievement. At each task, we need to know why it's there, because we should not have a system in which 10,000 faculty create their own courses in the interests of their knowledge of the students, supposedly, that prevents us from getting any evidence at all of how to make the system better. We have to fight against the collective amnesia, right, that shapes this field. And we have to do it in the interests of our students. This is what Dale Tillery was about, right? I saw one or two of his lectures here, but he was a hero of civil rights, equity, the purposes of these institutions. This is tricky business because Americans, we're going into really hard times. Americans prefer nostalgia to actual history. This is a character fault of the American people. What's at stake here? Community colleges are the engines of upward social and economic mobility. Everyone in this country thinks that democracy is going to be here because there are some documents in the Library of Congress that say so. The social fabric of democracy is built on a belief that people can have better lives, and more important, that their children can have better lives, that effort can matter for most people on average. When people stop believing that the vehicles for upward mobility work, the social contract that underlies democracy fails. The Weimar Republic. There have been other places that have had at least as enlightened democracies as we do, and in bad times they collapsed. There were no vehicles for upward mobility. The mission of our community colleges is to make sure that no matter where people are in their lives, they can advance those lives through effort and learning. That's why we cannot allow ourselves to have pathways that are broken, right? Because the risk is to the broader society, not just to the individual. And you know what? We can actually fix this. And I want to say one last thing about fixing it. Adriana Kazar, just this wonderful young scholar at USC, studied about, have you read this work? You need to read this work. You're going to love this work and make this talk worth it. She studied about 600 proposals for changing higher ed, and Pat, you would love this work too. 600 proposals to the federal government for improving higher education, and she characterized their theories of action. And it turned out that virtually all of them had one theory of action focused on one part of the system. There were some that posited the problem was in governance and proposed solutions in governance. So you get a lot of things. Let's fix developmental ed, but they're 95,000 miles away from students. Then there are institutional strategies, right? Then you have faculty mobilization strategies. It turns out, I think, that when you look at the successful changes in higher ed, and we do change, campus compact, service learning, 20 years ago was on 100 campuses, now it's on 3,000. Look at the spread of the green movement on college campuses. 1,000 campuses have green plans. In all those cases of success, there were integrated strategies between governance, institution, faculty, and outside organizations that faculty board in that send the message. What we need to fix this problem is a joyful conspiracy to link governance, institutional, and faculty action. But we have to start by taking responsibility for our own sector and then take responsibility to reach out to the others. Thank you. Yeah, so before question, I'm happy to take questions, but I just ask that you take a minute and chat with your neighbor about what you'd like to ask. Because we get better questions that way. I'm a teacher, hey.
So to do that, we'll take 1 minute, and then we'll have Yuri stay for some questions. What's your time?
No, I'll go after. It's so good to see you.
Well, that was an awfully nice job. You're saying some really important stuff. You know, I'm very pleased to hear it. Yeah.
You know, I've worked through that book you did with Tom Angelo.
Well, that is now, what, 15 years old?
Yeah.
And the level of selling is still like
yeah,
this.
it's full of great ideas.
Well, it was fun to do. That was, you know, and it was new at the time.
Yeah.
It was great. You should give that same talk when you go to after.
I enjoy your
That's what they need to
speech.
hear.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So this, we got to make progress on this.
Oh, I know. I don't know why it's taking so long. Because if they just heard you tonight over there, we did video, so I don't know if it's something that's going to be.
No, we got to.
But
This is about helping Tony own the vision and feel comfortable with it, and make sure that his team has the same vision and can support him, because he needs to lead, right? I think that's what it is.
Well, what I will send you tonight is something I can get on the internet. What I suggested to him, and I did it verbally as well, but I did put it in writing. Was you got all this scholars, but they need
Yes, we need this guy. We need better cross-fertilization, and we need better supports for achieving the dream in other people, so that they're not just doing their own thing and drinking their own Kool-Aid. All right, guys, I'm up for comments, questions, ideas.
And I would just say, I want to first of all thank Yuri for wonderful remarks. We brought you here to just what now seems like a fairly mundane task, which was to work on BSI. But now I feel like we ought to be thinking about how we're going to change the world of community college. So with that, have at them for questions. We only have them tonight.
So I'm happy to call on people.
Okay, I want to know, given what you've said about calculus and the institution, that it's not just community colleges, I mean it's through every educational institution, what would be a strategy that we can use to begin to change that?
Yeah.
Because that affects students transferring into four-year institutions.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is key. What we have articulation agreements, which are really important for transportability, that have become iron cages and prevent innovation.
Yes.
So this is where you need a joyful conspiracy of people in governance, institutions, and faculty to open up the process to allow work on missing pathways, like through statistics, right? And leave room for actually empirically validating the agreements that are there. This cannot happen without governance, institutional leaders, and faculty working together. And we got to work on this. All right. But that is key, because people feel trapped by agreements that were made for all the right reasons, and now are locking in, petrifying, freezing the system. Yes.
So, I'm interested in your comments about the number of developmental levels before transfer level courses.
Yeah.
And at our institution, one of our researchers has done some work that suggests a power relation, 0.8 to the L.
Yes. It's more like 0.6 to the L.
Okay, whatever you like. And I'm wondering if you've seen that. Is that throughout other institutions?
Yeah, well, the Colagno data, it's 0.58. Right, I mean, it's about 50%, 60% dropout at each level for people who pass, who make it through.
So 0.6 L, you're seeing that nationwide, sort of?
Yeah, nationwide. And there are a few exceptions, and the few exceptions tend to have quirky things. So you have exceptions that do Denver then one of the things about this field is the quality of evidence is very low for these studies. But you have case management approaches, you have intensification approaches, you have lots of patches on the problem, right? And they usually work for a few years and then they disappear, right? Because the mainstream program has the advantage. The special efforts usually are grant funded. They're framed as a movement or something of this sort. So they're sort of self-isolating and the immune system kills them off. So we need to go in there with a beneficial virus approach and with a sledgehammer in case the beneficial virus doesn't work. I'm for planned redundancy. Yes?
Well, I've got many questions and many comments. I have to first say how much I just enjoyed this talk. And you know, I was a former student of yours a few years ago, just pretend. And
1923, Paris. It was raining.
Actually, 89.
89.
Yeah, and it was just, but just to hear you teach again, and it reminded me of how inspired I was back then. So I just really want to thank you.
Thank you.
Great talk. I'll just go with the easiest question. I think there's just you talked about fixing the system. That kind of implies that at one time it worked, and now it's broken.
Yeah.
In the past, was there higher rates of success, and we've lost that somehow? Is the success rates going down? Is it
No, I think I'm talking about fix in the sense of a veterinarian. No, we need, yeah, I don't think that the developmental courses, I don't know the answer to this question, but I suspect that they did not have very high rates of success, ever. In part because the political economy of this, so these came up first after World War II, but mostly in the 60s as a response to the civil rights movement. The administration saw the diversification of campus as a political objective. The faculty were largely resistant to this in most places, just like they were resistant to the GI Bill. So once the administration saw it as a political problem that they had to manage, it became separate from the faculty and probably could not have worked, right? So this was an accident. Someone must have written about this and knows more about this than I do. But I think that's what actually happened, because very quickly this was handled by other people who were hired to deal with the problem, right? And then they made it into a deficit thing from the beginning. So I doubt that these courses ever had 60 or 70% success rates. And then there's the problem that the college algebra courses, if you look at this data, the Colagno data, it's in this Community College Resource Center, Tom Bailey, paper number 14, if you want to look at it on the web. There are actually all the data graphs in the states that have rich data. CCRC number 14. And you can see that even for kids who get perfect scores, the top 10% of scores on their placement tests, only 55% of them are passing that bloody course. So not only don't the courses work, the course they prepare you for don't work. That's not acceptable. Sledgehammer. Yes?
I've been very interested in some of the smaller ideas, if you will, in your talk, such as the linguistic structures necessary for complicated problems. And I don't even know how to start chasing that. Do you have any suggestions?
So it turns out that your buddy, Alan Schoenfeld, is working on this SERP project in San Francisco with Phil Darrow and a group of other people. And they've just taken this idea and are actually interviewing students and finding exactly the same thing. So they're creating a lab and working closely, sort of, going to high school together in different cities. We're working in touch with each other. We've taken the Shell Center Best Mars problems that have good data from David Foster, you know about this stuff. And we're actually interviewing students, studying the linguistic requirements, and explicitly teaching them the language through editing drills. And we're seeing, just as I saw in calculus, Hadassah Rin's dissertation and David Ferguson's dissertation, the kids pick it up quickly. 2 months. Well-chosen problems. So this is, what's the fine structure of what our students need to learn? How do we prioritize it if they've been severely undereducated? How do we decide what's most important? And the answer is not the weight of history.
Yuri, is there a reference there in response to Dan's question?
I'd go ask Schoenfeld. He writes, he knows. He must have already collected all the research on this.
Why don't you say
All
something
right.
about Carnegie's thinking about planning on?
So,
You and I are involved.
yeah, so the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching is one of the premier platforms for work in higher education. It's where TIAA-CREF was created, the Carnegie unit. We can fix that now. Carnegie classification. So Carnegie has tremendous possibilities. And the new president, Tony Breik, who's a great statistician and organizational theorist, has decided to actually work on this problem. So we are looking at missing pathways, thinking of beneficial virus. We don't want to generate antibodies early. So one of the things we're trying to do is, are there missing pathways that we can actually establish and develop evidence standards for them? And then the strategy is, once we have evidence standards, then we might ask about the evidence standards for the other pathways. Right? So this is one project at Carnegie. The other is to try to help with the joyful conspiracy. And that's why we have people like Bernadine and me who represent the institutional leadership side and the faculty leadership side. And we're enjoying wine and things like that, trying to figure out how to cook up the joyful part of the conspiracy. She's good at that, actually, I gotta say. So, okay, I'll hang around and speak with you individually. I think there's a reception.